Hey there, this is part 2 of my story. This week I'll be covering what it was like during anorexia. I'll mainly be focusing on the food and exercise components of it. Next week I'll begin to, talk about how my relationships were affected by anorexia, because I can then, add some continuity to it, to what it was like before anorexia, during anorexia, and after anorexia. So yeah, last week I mentioned that I started to control the particular food groups that I could eat, and this all stemmed from my New Year's resolution that I was going to quit fizzy drink because I felt as though they were bad for me, and to some extent this is true. And March I think of 2006, I quit chocolate, and this all again stemmed from a health component. Around this time, I was eating the normal number of calories. I wasn't counting calories by this point. I was just looking at food and thinking, is this healthy for me or not? And as a result, I was at a normal weight and I was still quite happy with my life. I wouldn't say that I had an eating disorder as such, but I did feel nervous if I couldn't control the food that I ate. So an example of this is school dinners. So I'd go into lunch, and I'd realise that the main meal included something that I knew that I couldn't eat, whether it be high fat red meat or some sort of chocolate dessert, for example. And as a result, there were some days that I just wouldn't eat school lunch, and then I would wait until dinner where I'd eat double. Again, by this point, I was still eating the normal number of calories, but I knew that there was something going on in the back of my mind saying, 1 minute, you're sort of controlling what you're eating to the extent that you can forego quite a lot of hunger for a substantial period of time. And I sort of remember it was around maybe May 2006. I looked at myself in the mirror, and I saw a very fat person. And this is called body dysmorphia. It's a very common thing with people who are suffering with eating disorders. They see themselves as something that they're not. And I remember, when I started, I just grabbed parts of my body and think, oh my god, this is fat, I need to get rid of it. Or I'd look at my stomach and think, oh my god, there's not a six-pack there, I need to get this six-pack. And, the media sensationalizing, this celebrity's six-pack regime, or, how to get a six-pack in 6 weeks kind of thing. It's not really helping the matter, because it makes males think as though they need to have this idyllic six-pack to look normal in society these days, which is completely untrue. So yeah, I just started to do quite a lot of exercise to try and, tone my muscles, look fitter, be fitter. And this meant that I did quite a lot of sit-ups, press-ups, running, and when PE came about in school, I was always the one who was raring to go. However, again, by this point, what I was eating was relatively unchanged. I knew that I was, the way I was eating wasn't completely normal, but I wasn't restricting myself to the point that I was starving myself. However, in maybe June of 2006, I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, okay, you're not getting the results that you need, even though people had started to realise that I was in fact losing weight. So this is again the body dysmorphia factor playing in. And, look at myself in the mirror, I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I know, let's start restricting what I'm eating. And so this meant that for the first time I started looking at the calorie counts of all the foods that I was eating. And because I've got a relatively good memory, I could commit something to memory the first time that I saw it. And this meant that, if someone says, do you want blah? I'd think, how many calories? Boom. Okay, no. And this meant that over time, I just started to restrict what I was eating from a normal amount to a subnormal amount to a very low amount. And this all stemmed from a voice inside my head, which I talked about in the question and answer session that I also released today. So I advise that you go and look at it, because I don't want to go over it again. It's quite a lengthy aspect to talk about. So yeah, this is when I started to also feel the need to hide food, because when you're in general society or even at home, you feel the need to keep up appearances, to say, look, even though I am losing weight, I am eating, look, it's probably something physically wrong with me, say hypothyroidism, for example. And I'm not going to say how I hid food, because that can be a triggering factor to people with eating disorders, but suffice it to say, I was quite good at it. So at school, if there were people around me, I would get a very big plate of food because I'd say, look what I have, and then I'd go to some corner of the school and just hide it there. Or at home, I'd do some things to make it look like I'd eaten, but in fact I had eaten a very small amount of what was given to me. And by this point, I was beginning, the human side of me, not the anorexic side of me, the human side of me was beginning to say, oh, hold on 1 minute, there's something really going wrong here. What are you doing? And it was maybe November 2006 that it's a very strong memory in my mind that I put a chocolate bar in front of me and thought to myself, eat it, you can do this, eat it. And I took one bite out of it and forced myself to swallow it, and as soon as I did, I felt a tremendous amount of guilt that I've never ever felt before in my life. And this forced me to do, I'm not going to say how many, but it forced me to do a substantial number of sit-ups in my room on my own with the door on the lock. And it was horrible. So I just sort of became submissive to this state of saying, all right, I'm not eating this anymore. And this meant that over time I was eating, a very low amount of calories. So yeah, that's what happened for a very long period of time, up to the point where I got admitted. However, what was happening in between them was, I'd go to the doctors quite a lot, and because I was a male, they tried to diagnose me with physical disorders. So I mentioned hypothyroidism, and this involved me getting, a lot of blood tests and whatever, and everything came back normal. The only things that weren't normal were the things that were due to my diet being completely, awful. And it was only it was my dad mainly who did a lot of research into possible clues into what was going on in my mind, and he found anorexia. I'd never heard of what anorexia was before that point. So he did a lot of research, and I remember the day we sort of went into the doctor's surgery, and they said, "Look, Simon, your reports have come in normal. We don't know what to do." And then it was at that point that my dad put a folder on the table and said, "Look, I've done a lot of research, and I think it's anorexia." And I looked bewildered. I was like, "What anorexia? What's that?" And they said, "Okay." So then they referred me to the psychiatric department of the hospital, and it was at that point that I became diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. In terms of what was happening at that point at home, uh, you know, anorexia is physically draining because you're not eating enough, and this meant that I'd get apnea from just trying to walk upstairs. My heart would skip beats. It was very distressing for me, and I have a very vivid memory back then of where I was in my bed, and it was maybe half an hour after I went to bed. I was a very low weight at that point, and my dad came into the room very sneakily to try and see if I was asleep. And he just kind of put his fingers on my neck to check my pulse to see if I was still alive. That was the extent that it reached. My dad thought that I could just die in my sleep. So yeah, that's the food and exercise component video done. I wouldn't next week be talking about relationships and what it was like at the early stages of trying to recover from anorexia. If you have any suggestions on what you want to hear from me, please put it in the comment sections below, and I'll try and emphasize that if I can. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much. See you next week. Oh.